Hello, everyone. Welcome to New Polity Podcast, our series, Politics of Paganism, and this episode, The Closed World. So we've gone through Plato, we've gone through Aristotle, we've spent 5.5 hours talking, going really slowly through the text, and the problem that we found, and the problem that they have in their political orders, is that it's a closed system. It's a closed world. Even going back to Plato's Republic, the idea of the noble lie, or the mixture of the elements, that who is the one who gives the law, or who's the ultimate legislator, who's the ultimate philosopher who creates the myth that keeps the whole city together.
Well, yeah, where does he come from?
Where does he come from? So what we're discussing today is what we take to be the chief pagan political problem of the closed world, that it seems to be men who are competing with each other for power and for glory, and it never really escapes the cycles of injustice.
Right. So, and this is somewhat abstract and speculative, I guess, but I think it's right. I think you're right that the closed world there's actually a metaphysical problem here. Right, which is very simple and very obvious, which is that an effect can't exceed its cause. Right, so the basic idea that the effect is always less than the cause. The cause is greater than the effect. Okay, you can't in some action exceed the energy. This is a physics, truism. Right, you can't exceed that which is put in. Right, so what is put in produces a sort of cap on what's possible. So if the effect can't exceed its cause, then how is it that we can build an ever greater, sort of an ever more true or an ever more just or an ever more properly ordered regime? Where does the energy, where does the vitality come from? Right? If it's all trapped within, if it's a closed system. So if you have a closed system, then what you have to see instead is that closed system is self-perpetuating. So it's never greater than what it was previously. It's just it can be moving in a sort of ever fluctuating circular pattern, right? Where it's just pushing itself around and around and around. That's conceivable within a closed system, the rotating, the circular. But the ascending or the achieving of that which somehow wasn't already present within it is impossible. And I think that seems to be the dominating problem, right? Because if you look at someone like Plato, he knows that the true good, the truth itself, lays somewhere out there, right? Somewhere higher, the sun itself, somewhere out and above. But how would you ever get to it? And he addresses this with the whole analogy of the cave, right? That the man in the cave has to be forcibly dragged out by somebody who's already higher, right? Who's already up there. And that's that force from without. Yes. Right? That it's not a closed system. So if somebody comes from above and grabs you and says, hey, come on, let's go look at the sun. So now we have something coming from without. But the resources within the cave, that it does not have the resources for some guy to say, hey, I wonder if I should unstrap myself and turn around and look up. Like those thoughts aren't available to him until something from without comes in. So you have this. So he sees, look, this is what we need, someone from without. But then in the Republic, the problem of where that philosopher who comes from without, where he comes from, is never resolved. Right? It's never resolved. It's ultimately Socrates. And like we've talked about before, that the first lines of the book are that Socrates comes down, right? And it's like, well, from where? It's like, well, we can't start this discussion until we have the guy coming down, but we can't account for where he comes from.
Yeah, he comes down into Piraeus, beginning the Republic, and really, and D.C. Schindler argues this, he descends into the cave of appearances. There's a kind of intention with Plato that the philosopher has to descend into the men of Piraeus, the democracy. The philosopher, what we're also encountering is the philosopher is a strange reality within the city, or he is seeing past the fact that the closed system is itself a closed system constructed by men, right?
Well, he thinks he is. The problem is Everybody thinks that about themselves. So you can't, the problem is, so the philosopher in any given city can see the contingency of the city, can see that its law is not the law of the cosmos itself. What's what makes him a philosopher, right? Is he sees into the deeper truth of things. But there's no way of knowing, of him knowing that he's not merely in a higher level of perpetual motion, right? Like he's not just participating in some other myth that's bigger, that contains the city in which he's the philosopher for this city, but he's just a normal old slave in the next biggest structure, right? And like, because if you think about within the city itself, I mean, within the divisions or the hierarchy within any given city, the higher ones kind of know that the lower ones are childlike. Mm-hmm. Right. And that, I mean, all the way down, most obviously in the family itself, where the parents look at the children and they're what they believe about truth and justice and all that. And it's like, oh, that's nice, whatever, but we see through it. So the parent is the philosopher to the child and therefore instructs him and teaches him and brings him up into a higher level of being. Mm-hmm. Right. Well, why wouldn't that just continue forever?
So one element of this closed system then is that each level in the city, each class in the levels of power believe themselves to be to be living out nature, or right, to be living out true justice, right?
Yep. They believe their myth to be true. That's what makes it a myth.
Right. And so the philosopher in the city, like we're seeing, because it's the closed system, what Plato's cave really shows to us is that the philosopher perceives there's something higher, there's something beyond the construction of the city, but is unable to determine whether or not that which is higher is actually the construction of another philosopher.
Exactly.
Above him.
Yeah.
Which is, because it's almost, maybe we could summarize with the closed system that there's no, let's say, surety of transcendence breaking in any of the, like,
That's
at
right.
the same time, Plato's cave has a kind of element of, there's a transcendence that goes down into the cave and then raises the philosopher up to see truth itself. You're unable to determine whether or not that really is transcendence, or if someone else is utilizing you being brought out of the cave for their own benefit.
That's right. That's right. So as long as the sociality of man is understood in the Aristotelian, and I think like sense of corporate, right? So that the end is not an end that's achieved by all the people within it, but by the elite or the one. Then you have a strict hierarchical understanding, right? And if you have a strict hierarchical understanding, then there's no way that at any point in the hierarchy is there any ground on which to judge that which is higher than you. You can't determine whether or not you're in. You actually, strictly speaking, aren't capable of perceiving the higher levels, right? So this is the reason why, say, the sort of middling classes, if they have an oligarchy that is not presenting itself as a part of the middling classes, but is presenting itself is verging into a tyrannical presentation, that middling class is only capable of judging them according to the justice that structures them. So they're unjust because they're not behaving like a proper middling class. Do you see what, like they don't? Yes. There's no, the justices that each realm or each level in the hierarchy live in are themselves closed, right? So you can't ever break out of that. I mean, the philosophical move would be something like, nothing's true, or I don't know what's true, or I can't. Even my own perceptions are necessarily embedded in this sort of nihilistic problem.
Yeah, of my class,
of who I am and my class and my grouping. So, and then you'd have to say, well, even that thought is, and you come in an infinite regress. So it's a trap, and I think that, I mean, what I think is that someone like Thomas Hobbes, the genius of someone like Thomas Hobbes is to perceive that and to say, okay, I mean, we were aware of Hobbes's, it's like a scientific beliefs that there's nothing that it is the world itself is a closed system. It's just things pushing on things. The cosmos is, right? It's just an infinite flux of things pushing on things.
Yeah.
And And so he says he starts metaphysically and scientifically with this closed system, and then goes to politics. And so if we look at him, you can see, I think, a very, very brilliant thinking through of what the political looks like if you accept the closed system at the onset, right? What is the inevitable result? And the inevitable result for him is the Leviathan, which is what someone like Bap would refer to as totalitarian democracy. Right, the rule of the mass according to a fanatical total law, right? Like the mass is fanatically devoted to a law that governs every aspect of their being, and that complete commitment of the complete mass is clearly the most powerful thing if you have a closed system that is premised on a struggle within it for power, right? So if you, I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. So so we have the different classes of the few, the one, the many. Then if we're in a the Hobbesian universe or metaphysic here, where things are just hitting upon things in a closed system,
right?
Then what we're seeing with Aristotle and Plato is this problem of the different classes and how to sort the classes. But which class wins, right? Like which, in the struggle of power in the long term, it ends up for both. Aristotle's trying to figure out how he can combine it, but Plato is very clear that it ends up in democracy and it ends up in the masses winning. And then what the tyrant does is really flatter the masses and treat them as divine in a type of sense because they're providing him all his power, initially. So what you end up with the Leviathan then, right, is the masses making, very similar to what Bab says, a totalitarian democracy, nomos, that they're the divine kings that are ruling, even though it's leveling everything to the bottom.
Yeah, but the insight here is that there's no way out of that. So if you accept the closed system, so it's a struggle for power in a zero-sum game. All right, it's a struggle for power, and it's like Schmidt and these guys, or Adrian Vermeule, whatever, that we'll talk about. Okay, if power isn't one place, it's someplace else. Okay, so like this, it's just a total sort of zero-sum game for control over the social thing, for control, for the exercise of your will. But only one will can rule, and so it's a contest in any given circumstance over whose will that is. And if you're in that struggle, then it's just a matter of logic. It's just a matter of sort of, or even Darwinian kind of evolutionary theory, that in that struggle, the strongest thing is going eventually to drive out the weaker things. The weaker constructions are going to lose, and the stronger constructions are going to win. So you don't have to posit some sort of philosophical necessity to the democratic totalitarianism. You don't have to posit that somehow in our anthropology there's something in us that makes us always want to submit, or you don't have to posit any of that. You can just say, if we play the game out, the social entities that for whatever reason have the fanatical commitment of the mass to its law is the strongest thing, which means if that's the strongest thing, it will always eventually emerge and it will always win. Right? That's just a matter of playing the game long enough. So you can have then these episodes within the contest of aristocratic rule and warrior groups, and you can have these episodes, but they're always losing. And really what's going on is that you have, whenever you have those various regime forms, what you're actually seeing is the contest of regime forms expanding into a larger game. So what I mean is, what you're getting is the smashing into each other of different contestants within the game, right? And so in those initial contacts, it's like, okay, you have this like warrior band or whatever that is strong because of its fanatical commitment to its law, its honor, its glory, it's whatever it is. So it's a little democratic totalitarianism, right? It's but relatively small and powerful because of its total commitment to what it is. And it runs up against something that's weaker than it and manages to conquer that people and then holds them in subjugation. But as soon as that, now you've got a new context for the struggle, right? Now you have the new sort of field of play now includes this subjected mass and this aristocratic ruling class. Well, as soon as that becomes the field of play, then that then becomes the entity that's now going to move towards democratic totalitarianism, because that now the contest between the relatively powerful aristocrats within that setting, so now they're in contest with each other, which is always the case, right? It's always going to be the case that the one who can rally more of the mass and more of the mass in an ever more convincing manner to his cause is going to win over the ones who can't. So over the course of playing it out, you're going to get the total state, the total regime.
So when you have the aristocrats who then are governing over a mass, and they're competing with power for each other, against each other to get more and more power,
right,
then it makes sense that whoever can get most of the mass in line with what they want, and the reason that he can get in line with what they want is because he's playing on their already held law.
Oh yeah,
right. So
yeah.
the aristocrat who can most flatter and pull up the masses for his own power beats the others. But this is the problem we introduced last time with the master-slave dialectic, right? Because the master becomes enslaved to the slaving mechanism, or he becomes enslaved to the making of he becomes enslaved to his slaves, right?
Right.
So if we have aristocrats battling it out, right? They're trying to see who's going to be the sovereign, who's going to be the one. Well, they have to play within the masses' already held law to get them on their side to beat the other aristocrats, and then you basically have the ascendancy of the masses' law, and then you're in the totalitarian democracy.
And it's
thing
even
again.
more dark or more like disturbing, because it's not merely that the rival aristocrats are playing the mass, but the strongest ordering is inevitably when the aristocratic comes to believe it. Right, what I mean, like he's not just pretending to believe in the law of the mass, but is all in.
Oh, okay, yeah.
That's stronger than the guy who's not all in. So it's not even, you see what I'm saying? Like the guy who's faking it is holding something in reserve. The guy who's all in is not. So even just playing out the competition game, it's not merely going to be the guy who can kind of trick the masses the most. It's ultimately going to be the one who becomes one of them, right? And so and is capable, therefore, of total commitment to the cause of the law which he believes to be justice itself, right?
Yeah, it becomes a kind of race to the bottom, right?
Race to the bottom.
Like your politics. No, there's a lot of things we can draw. We're in an election cycle, but
well, I mean, it's obvious.
It's obvious.
That
like
what we're talking about
trying
is present
to,
right now. Yeah.
Yeah. Everyone's trying to be as close to the law of the people as possible, and whatever they want, right? And it's a number of different things, but we're not going to get totally into that. But you can see how that is the most powerful thing you can do, is to fully be bought into the law of the people and then play upon it and then defeat your enemies.
Right, and that's what constitutes the Leviathan. I mean, that's Hobbes's insight, is what constitutes what the Leviathan is this corporate power that no one controls. Right? It's not like the sovereign. This is such a misreading of Hobbes, that like the sovereign somehow controls the Leviathan. Right? The Leviathan is what the sovereign is integrated into it. As soon as that leader, as soon as he acts in any way counter to what the law that is holding Leviathan in being, then he's destroyed by it. He can only work within it and serve it just the same as everyone else, and which is the reason why it becomes the god. Right? So for Hobbes, it's the man-made god. It's the mortal god. So, and this is this is paganism, that the work of human hands is perceived to be the divinity itself, right? But it's only in that, not just the perception that it's the divinity, and then the devotion and the worship of that divinity is the strongest construction. So you always end up with the man-made God, right? And so with the temple slave state, like that's the strongest thing in the pagan world.
Yeah.
Which is, and if you look at pagan history, that's what it tends to, right? It tends to the absolutist, totalized temple slave state. Right.
Oh yeah, there's numerous examples. Right?
Yeah, like this is where it goes.
Let's think of Egypt. Let's think of even the Greek city-states. Like
even
they're
Rome,
known for temples where where the masses will come and they'll offer sacrifice, and then they'll that's also where all the money was, because it's the centralized unit. It's the temple state that eventually it is the masses' means of ruling. Like it's the sovereign, it's the rulers and the masses within one creation of idolatrous God.
Right. Yeah. So the even within Rome itself, the trajectory once the Republic is overthrown and the empire is established, right? Which from the very beginning, from that very first move, you have the introduction of divinity into the ruling structure itself with Augustus, but it itself has a trajectory towards Diocletian, right? Like towards Jupiter incarnate, towards men groveling on their hands and knees before the god who is nothing else than the state, right? Towards the formation of exactly the kind of totalized temple slave state we're talking about. But Rome is different because it's contending with Christianity, and that's a different topic, right? That we're going to get into. But with absent Christianity, that's just the cycle. It always ends up with Pharaoh, right? It always ends up there, and then fails eventually. Peters out, fails, but it only fails because another one is conquering it. That's the sort of insight.
Right. So the Hobbesian insight here is that if it is failing, it is not the most powerful. Right.
Exactly.
Like, so there's a science of power going on here that actually really explains the closed circle, because what he's saying is there always is a most powerful.
There's always a relatively more powerful. Right.
And that one inevitably will win out in as a kind of metaphysical claim. It's kind of like, this is how power operates, is that one will win. And that the one that the masses are constructing their god, and the aristocrats or whoever, the leaders who
end up serving that god.
Yeah.
I mean, this is why the god kings of antiquity still sacrifice their children on the altar, right? It's like, well, it must be the case that the most powerful thing is the regime in which the king is willing to do that, because he also is worshiping the totalized temple slave state, which is the law of the mass. Do you see? Like, that becomes the most powerful conceivable grouping, right? To believe it's God. Right?
Yeah, and it places, so there's another thing this at least for me does, which is the kind of idea that you'll have like a leader who is just sovereign and he doesn't have to really compromise. Like
it's stupid. It's a stupid idea.
Well, I don't know exactly what Agamben means by homo sacer, but the idea that the leader can be he can be sacrificed, but he can't be like killed by law. Mm-hmm. So there's something about the sovereign when he is in the construction of the god king via the people, the idolatrous middle. Mm-hmm. Then the leader takes a kind of honorific representation of God, but you can kill the god. Like, the people can kill the sovereign, right? But you can stab Caesar in the back, but you can't bring him to court. And there's something to that.
Oh, totally. Don't you think that's pointing back to the founding murder idea that we talked about back when we talked about Augustine in the scripture? Is that the founding murder, the murder, the extra legal murder, is the ground for the regime. So when we're talking about the competition for power here, it's always with the murder in the background. Like, the most powerful thing is the thing that can kill everything else becomes relative. Everything else becomes within, like, a construction within the frame of reference or the horizon of the murder, right? So it's like the king has power as long as he rules within that horizon, right? And so he can, but his power is always, the horizon is bounded by murder, by war, right? That's what produces the boundaries of it. And so he can always be killed. It's necessary that he be killed, which is the point we're making, is that even the ruler is a slave to the regime. He himself is under death, the reign of death, and the constant threat of death.
Yeah.
Right? Just like everyone else. I think that's the main insight. So the dream, or the sort of fantasy of sovereign power, is ridiculous. Right? The sovereign is always the mass. Right? And Aristotle says as much. Yeah. I mean, Aristotle says as much. The majority is always the ruler.
Yeah, isn't this the kind of trick, right? Like, it's almost, I mean, you can almost classify it in terms of the fall, of where the demons promise power, but that you don't get power, right? Like,
no, mankind. It's a very twisted sort of promise, because in a sense, you do. I mean, like, the knowledge of good and evil, say, right? It's like, you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you'll be like a god. You'll have the knowledge of good and evil, and it's like, well, sort of, right? Now, we are like a god, but not any individual, but the corporate thing is now a god. The corporate thing now determines good and evil, right? So it's sort of true that mankind became a god and became the source of good and evil, but all the individual people within it are totally subject to its violence.
It's kind of the backstop of the Hobbesian insight here, is that the aristocrats want, to play the power of the masses or whatever, to, like, they want it. They think that it'll achieve some grand, glorious power, and it does in a sense, but, like, you're losing more and more as you gain more power, because the masses are the more powerful. So you're never actually being the total God creator of good and evil. You're still within it. Like, it's like,
totally right.
It's the paradox of men strive after power, as Hobbes will say, but then you get all the power and realize you have none of the power because all the masses have the power, right? Like,
that's the only way to have power. That's this. I don't even think this is very complicated, and it's strange to me that it's so constantly overlooked, right? Like, if you're the source of good and evil, all right, you're the sovereign, you are the god, your will is law, you are that. Okay. Well, the only reason you're the source of good and evil, meaning that whatever your power is constituted in the masses adopting or accepting your construction, and this is like in sovereign theory, like your construction of good and evil as being good and evil, right? They now abide by it or believe it. Well, that means you can't change it. I mean, now it's like, well, the only reason why they obey me is because I speak the good and evil that is the law that constitutes them. Right? Like, okay, it may be the case in some mythical beginning that you were the source of that, but that's not true. But let's just grant it to them. Sure. Right? Then that your arbitrary will was the source of it. But your entire power is predicated on that having been alienated from you. Right? And that now becoming the law of the city itself. Well, at that point, where it happened to your power? Now you serve it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, now you serve your own power, and continually you're trying to maintain
this is the whole problem of the tyrant. It's the reason why the tyrant is the most servile of all people, the most unhappy of people, the man who has no friends. I mean, like Plato and Aristotle know this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it just makes me think of different stories in Scripture. I mean, even when we were talking to Augustine about Lamech, right? Like when Lamech, being a descendant of Cain, and having this scene where he's talking to his two wives and saying, Cain is avenged, but Lamech sevenfold if you mess with me, right?
Right.
Like, basically, to his two wives, he's trying to keep them in submission, but now he's having to put in all this extra, power to just make sure he maintains his power and the city itself. And when in Genesis 4, when you have the Tower of Babel, what is it? Genesis? We might be a little bit later, but where the Tower of Babel is it basically just looks like the Leviathan, right? It's a state where they're building a tower to the sky with all the masses making one conglomerate God, you know, that can stand opposed to God. And interestingly, that happens after the sons of God and the daughters of men, and the shortening of the lifespan and all this stuff. But what we can see here is that when man makes himself God, or when man tries to construct good and evil on his own terms, then he is also ruling men who want to construct good and evil.
Exactly.
Right? And men who want to use the construction of a particular world for their own benefit. And this is what Thomas will call the lex fomes, or the law of concupiscence.
Right.
It's that the initial fall brings about a change in desire, which almost could be described, as Hobbes does, as power after power, like where you're trying to achieve more power to fulfill desires that can never actually be fulfilled,
right,
because they have a scarcity to it of the material things you can enjoy.
Right, it's a closed world.
So within the closed world of the city, where you're continually constructing worlds to benefit your own power, everyone becomes enslaved to everyone. And
that is the inevitable consequence. Right. And wherever that is not the case, it's war.
Oh, it's war between different
Leviathans. Wherever it's not the case that wherever groupings of slaves encounter each other, so there's a space where there isn't a closed society of slaves that are bound together. Wherever that encounter, war is with the result. So you're either submitted or you're at war. And that can include civil war, right? Like war.
Oh yeah,
because for Hobbes, the actual units are fluid, right? The boundaries are fluid. Like it doesn't matter where they are. I mean, you have a competition of all against all that always results in groupings, because that's the most powerful thing. But those groupings are themselves constantly in flux and moving. And those, sometimes the groupings are within what we think of as states. Sometimes the groupings are between states, sometimes between alliances of states. It doesn't matter, right? The groupings are, the Leviathan is this, wherever you find the power that to hold people in subjugation to it, wherever you find that, you're looking at Leviathan of some size or another. But the inevitable consequence is the amassing of ever bigger Leviathans.
Yeah, and maybe we could move to that with war, because it seems like Plato and Aristotle are both trying. So in the construction of the Leviathan, war, there's an interesting out here, like a potential that, well, let's just imagine a kind of imperial formation whereby the will of the people is continually growing because they're conquering more and more, right? So it's almost the idea that, well, if we're striving after power, what if the enemies always remain external and we just keep conquering, right? So what if instead of this Leviathan eventually collapsing under its own weight, or because everyone becomes contentious and starts to tear at the city and then it starts to collapse? What if, as Plato puts it in The Just City, that we have a very large warrior class of which the masses are a part of, and they're always conquering the outside? And actually, Machiavelli says a very interesting, his discourses on Livy, where it's the exact same thing, that with Rome, because the masses were contentious for more and more, they were willing to be a part of the Roman army for imperial formation. So there's a possibility here of, well, if the closed system ends up collapsing under its own weight, what if we just imperially keep conquering the outside until it all conquers?
Yeah, that may be a better strategy for surviving longer, which means it's the strategy that will ultimately be fulfilled or be deployed, which is what we see, the construction of empires. Pagans build empires, right? So like paganism is inevitably drawn towards empire construction, right? And I suspect it's for the very reason that you just said, that's a stronger thing than the slave state that doesn't build empires.
Yeah, right.
So like it wins in the contest. It's the thing that wins out in the end. But it doesn't. I don't think it solves the problem, because the competition or the strength of the empire building state remains. What am I trying to say? It is still the case that an empire building state would be stronger if the people who make up the armies are completely, to the depths of their very souls, subservient to the regime. right? So that and being an empire, a conquering empire, is stronger than not. So again, it still requires, or it still will tend to, the totalizing democratic slave state that then is also imperialistic.
Yeah. Okay. So they feed into each other, right?
I think they necessarily. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think so.
Okay. So even the imperial kind of, because with Plato and Aristotle, Aristotle, has this this kind of drive for self-sufficiency, which we were talking about. You said you're kind of bored by the concept, right?
Well, I just don't understand it.
Yeah, because the slaves, the slaves
Which
who are
maybe
within.
is my problem, but
Well,
I've never understood it for decades. I've tried, and it's like I can't wrap my head around why that matters. But go ahead.
yeah. Well, you want to you do a sophistic move by having the slaves classified as property, and so now you don't have the problem of bringing them in the regime. But the slave, so the self-sufficient, we can imagine then what self-sufficiency could just be the other internal term of imperial formation, right? So it's the result, right? So
I see what you're saying. I
so
think that's good.
You build empire that continually goes out, gets more and more slaves, that perfects the internal slavery mechanism in order for an imperial. And this is also, and I keep bringing in other people, but Hannah Arendt's insight with the Nazi regime, with the Stalinist regimes, is that war on the outside creates more of a totalitarian slavery on the interior.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, that seems right to me.
So so we're not just looking at the city as just one entity. It is already, if the Leviathan, if this is correct here, it's always moving in a grander and more imperial direction in order to keep itself going.
Yeah, until it encounters the force that beats it, the stronger one. Right.
Yeah.
Which is inevitable.
Yeah, and it also reminds me of Daniel's prophecy in the Old Testament, right? Because Daniel sees this vision while he's in Babylon, and there, it was the Israelites were conquered by a foreign empire, and he's brought into Babylon, and he sees this vision of the four beasts, which were interpreted as first the Babylonian, then the Medo-Persian empires, and then the Greek, and then the Roman, and that there is a kind of progression of bigger and bigger empires that he's seeing that come about. And then the end of his prophecy is when God enters into the scene, right?
Right.
So what we're setting up here with this closed world, and I think what we want to draw out that we're seeing from Plato and Aristotle and from the whole pagan context, and that Hobbes really helps us to see in a kind of science of politics, is the problem of a world of human construction. It's the problem of the desires being corrupted. It's a problem of ultimately sin, that it's the construction of man-made idols that bring about slavery. So this, and then I guess we can move to where we're getting to with Aquinas and Treatise on Law, that Christianity is the assertion of a breaking into that system. That, as we saw with Augustine, the creation of the city and the original founding murder, and then the construction of a morality to rule the city, and what the pagans are finding themselves in closed systems that are all competitions of power among humans, among other men,
which results in the creation of man-made gods that everyone must serve. Ironically, I mean, it's like the most debased. It's so ironic, isn't it? Like the competition for the most grand, the strongest, the men always results in men worshiping blocks of wood. The humiliation of that, which is what the prophets point out in the Old Testament, right?
Yeah, right. And that's kind of the whole witness of the prophets, versus it's even going back to Joseph in Egypt, right? Like and then Moses and all of the plagues, and the constant witness that Israel provides to the nations in the Old Testament is that they are enslaved to their idols,
which they create.
which they've created. It's the work of
Yeah,
their own hands that they've done.
Yeah.
And so, so it's the revelation of idolatry, and then the assertion of the breaking in of transcendence, right? It's the assertion of God not remaining completely outside.
Yeah, it's a shattering of the closed world. That's what we have to have. And that, and it can't be the Platonic move, which would be, and maybe this is unfair to Plato, but I'll call it that because I think it's generally true about Platonism. The idea that the breaking through of the transcendent is just something that occurs at the top, right? Because that doesn't solve the problem, right? It just adds more layers higher, right? Like that the breaking through is down and through the whole, which is the great significance, like you pointed out the other day, of Christ coming in in the form of a slave, like at the bottom. So from the bottom to the top, we now have the breaking in of an outside, right? Of an other, of something that lays beyond human construction. And that changes the entire political dynamic. The whole thing is different. Everything is different, right? And I think Thomas's treatise on law, we spend some time on this. We're going to spend some serious time on this, I think, because we're going to have to, is an extremely sophisticated explanation of how that works, right?
And we should be clear here that that this is opening a space for faith, and not just pure. Because reason itself, what we're seeing in Plato, reason itself is trapped within the cycle.
Absolutely.
So, and St. Paul asserts this in Romans, that the things which the pagans should have known about God that were clear to them, which is God's divinity and his providence in creation, those, and that he should be given thanks, that God is there and that he has to be given thanks, that those are rejected for the construction of the idols, basically.
Right. Yep.
And what they should have known of God, they have given up. So God has given them up to their base desires. And what happens when God gives man up to his base desires is that his reasoning is darkened.
Oh yeah, right.
And I think
Absolutely.
what we're seeing with the multiple caves example with Plato is that reason's darkened as to the way out. Right? Like when you're in the closed system, it's that reason is trapped in there too.
And reason operates in that realm. I mean, this is something that when we say, sometimes people get annoyed with us when you say reason itself is fallen, right? Reason itself is subjugated to this closed system, and they want very desperately for natural reason to retain its rationality.
Sure.
Because I don't know why. But anyway, I mean, I have some theories, but they're probably not very charitable most of the time. But anyway, but what's failing, what you're failing to see is that reason can operate in smaller worlds, right? And still be rational, but be cramped, hamstrung, tight, like small.
Yeah.
Right? So like the example I always give my students is the example of like a drug addict who comes to live in a world as they descend deeper into the addiction, which is the fomes, the passions, right? Into the sensuality, the addiction, the compulsion to acquire this scarce pleasure. That the deeper you go into it, the more the world around you appears only in its relevance to the drug, right? So the people around you become increasingly merely how it is that they can help you attain the drug. The stuff around you is whether or not you can pawn it for money to get the drug, right? Like the police, the society is all about whether or not they're going to keep you from getting the drug. Right? What I mean is everything becomes in reference to this finite thing, but within that now little world, it's rational, right? Like you can properly order those things so that you attain the drug. You can accurately perceive how it is that this thing is relevant to the acquiring of the drug, and that person might be helpful. And you can be very clever and very rational, right, within that little world.
Yes, totally.
But the world is tiny and shrinking and ordered towards this finite thing, and therefore ultimately futile.
Chesterton has an example of that with madness, where he says the madness is when reason is too small. And he gives the example of the man who thinks the police are chasing him at every corner, like the FBI is behind every door or whatever. And he looks down the street and he sees someone he thinks is following him, and so he starts to run this way and whatever. And actually he's not he's not mad because he's lost his reason. His reason just is totally contained in a circle that that ends up in he's always being chased. It's like, but that's perfectly rational.
And this is what we're talking about with the caves upon caves, or if we're talking about the different social classes and their conceptions of justice. It's all the same idea here, that there's worlds of larger, more expansive, or more cramped rationality. And none of those are totally divorced from rationality itself. There's still participations in rationality, and even participations in goodness and justice. They're just becoming smaller and more cramped, right? And so we don't need to posit, when we talk about the wounding of rationality, the wounding of reason, it's not that we no longer are human beings. It's that our humanity is becoming more animalistic, and so our reason is becoming smaller and smaller as it approaches instinct. But even at the worst we ever get, we're still being rational. We're just rational in this little tiny, like, bouncing off the walls type of rationality.
Right.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Through a kind of through the corruption of desire, right? So the corruption of desire creates smaller worlds that aren't opening up to any type of transcendence, not opening up to God, but are merely the fulfilling of desires. Which again, we're back to the totalitarian democracy.
And exactly, that's where it ends up. And you can see then where the breaking through of the transcendent at every level and every place opens up rationality, right? So now there's not those little walls that you're bouncing off of, but you become rational within proximate. There's proximate ends that then are ordered to larger ends, or ordered to larger ends that are ultimately ordered to the totally transcendent end. And so rationality need not ever be bound, right? Even though it's always operating within worlds, that we don't get out of that context. It's just that the worlds themselves become no longer closed down. The worlds themselves become open upward, which is a posture of humility, which is the reason why the pagans won't have it.
Yeah, and what we're saying with this then is that faith properly restores reason to man. Like that's
the objective, yeah.
Right. So another thing with the closed world is that we're saying that reason becomes less than what it can be, right? Like the reason becomes just utilization for achieving the desires in your constructed world of good and evil, and that what we can see in that is the necessity of reason being open to the transcendent, and that has to occur through faith, right? Like faith isn't just, oh, well, we have faith and, the Christians are just trying to solve all these problems with faith or whatever. But it's what we're trying to assert also is that reason becomes unreasonable, right?
Right. Well, this is, I mean, to come into modernity here, this is John Paul II. In his encyclical on faith and reason, he begins it in the little preface as that faith and reason are, I don't remember the exact words, but the gist of it is that faith and reason are the two wings upon which the human soul ascends to God. But the idea is not faith is what has to, sometimes that's cited by people who don't understand it, right? Because the point is the ascent requires both wings. Right, like you don't get anywhere with one. Reason flapping by itself, that you don't get off the ground at all. Right? It's not like, well, reason can take you so far, and then faith takes you so much further. Like that's not the way that image works. Right? Without both of them, you go nowhere. Right?
You don't fly.
You don't fly at all. Not that you get to fly so high, and then you need something else. That's not the way it works at all. You don't move. Right? You flap on the ground in a sort of pagan, closed, circular world that you ever can't get out of. You're just flapping around.
And you never do get to a point you can, and I think Plato and Aristotle also show us the kind of in the political problem, the traps you're in with reason, that you seemingly hit all these different ceilings that you never reach transcendence. And what we can say is that reason needs faith, but we can't then say, faith is contained in reason or something like that. Like it is the case that it is it
has to explode.
It has to come from above.
It has to come from outside. Otherwise, what we're talking about here is futile. Doesn't matter. It's just another myth. It's just another layer.
Yeah, and
to the same problem.
And Augustine might be helpful on this when he's discussing Paul's explanation of faith in Romans 8, where faith has to be a gift. First of all, it has to be a grace given to you by God. so it can't be something that you achieve on your own, that you come to faith.
Yeah,
that God has to
and
give
that's
you
that
faith.
reaching from above down, right?
He has to give you that initial gift of faith, and then he also has to give you the grace to actually have faith, or to have that infused virtue of faith, and then the grace to persevere in that faith. And this goes both with God as creating man as a being that has his end in God, that it's from God and to God, and that God has to be present in the salvation of man and the restoring of what he's fallen from, and also bringing him to something greater than the natural end he had, right? And that reason becomes restored to man through faith. And this can then help us to see that from where we started with Augustine, that we, as Christians, I think we boldly can say we can understand the pagan.
Right.
Like we can. That's right. We can boldly say we see the whole of the closed world and the closed system, and being born under sin, the church is a part of that whole dynamic going on. But it's because God has stepped in to save man that the church is now not trapped within it.
It's not trapped. That's right. It's in it, but not trapped in it. Or it's in history, but reaches beyond history. Or, the whole analogy of being it's in and beyond. It's, it's this sort of paradoxical, seemingly paradoxical, but actually very beautiful conception of man as being in the world, but in the world as that which reaches beyond the world. But the reaching beyond, because of the whole problem of effect and cause that we've been talking about, that reaching beyond of one's own nature is something that can also only come from without. But we are that which is capable of being elevated beyond ourselves.
Yes.
Right? And that is the special dignity of man, but also the great danger. Because if we're not elevated beyond ourselves, then what's left to us is not ourselves, but lesser than ourselves, because we are that which is to be elevated beyond ourselves. So if we do not pursue that elevation, then we're actually less than what we are. You see, like we don't have the option of just subsisting in the middle.
Yeah.
Right. That's like an animal. That's not available to us, and that's the reason why the breaking off from the transcendent leads into this downward spiral into ultimately despair, right? And inhumanity.
I mean, we could talk about the incarnation in this then, because what we're seeing with Plato and Aristotle, with the construction of the myth to rule the whole regime, and the idea of the philosopher king, or basically the construction of the god, right? And we with the Leviathan, we have the construction of the man-made god through this competition of power, and in the Roman times of Augustus claiming to be the son of God, and so. But what this also speaks of is the desire that God and humanity become, that divine and human action actually do meet. Right?
Well, that's the irony.
The
irony is that the pagan construction of God kings, that we're going to be God, and then the Christian sort of resolution is a God man, who's a king.
Yeah.
Right. Like we want to be God. Man wants to be God. Man wants to be God. That's our original fall. But then what's the condition in the Trinity right now after the ascension? Is that human nature is a part. I mean, Jesus Christ ascends back to the life of the Trinity with his human nature. Like we are.
Yeah, God has become man.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Man has become striving to make a man God. Actually, this Vladimir Soloviev is just wonderful on this. He has essays on divine humanity, Eastern philosopher. But he talks about that there's, in the city of God and city of man, there's two movements. One is the construction of the man God, and the other is the belief in the God man. Right? Like, there's a kind of, for the city of man, a movement of man to make himself God. But what we see in the Incarnation is the kenosis. It really is the emptying of God to go all the way down to become man. And then, Athanasius's great line, that which is not assumed is not redeemed, that he takes up everything that is human.
Well, that's the thing. It's like what we're not, if we're talking about the pagans as temple slave states, as basically cults of worship that are also power, it's not that the Christian solution is then to, oh, we're just going to have secular human order that is not now ordered to the divine, or gods are no longer relevant, or that's not, it's the objection to the pagan is not that it's devotional or that it's based upon some conviction of some kind of supernatural entity or something. That's not the solution to the pagan problem. Is it's almost like the fulfillment of it, or the surpassing of it into being totally, like the political is now totally adopted or brought up into what moderns call the religious, but meaning the ordering of man to the divine. Right now, the political is integrated directly into that, not as a ruse, but in fact.
Mm-hmm. Through the incarnated.
Yes.
And so humanity then is able. Well, part of this, right, is when God became man, he takes on everything in sin. He takes on the effects of sin. He takes on sin. He takes on the human desires. He brings all of that upon himself. But what is accomplished is he lives out the life of the perfect man, of the truly just man, mm-hmm. right? Like we were seeing with in the Republic, of the just man in the corrupt city, that he, as Socrates will say, he'll be crucified, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it did end up happening. That when Christ lives the righteous life, when he lives through his faith, when what Christianity brings in the church is to be incorporated into that divine humanity. Mm-hmm. Like what we're with Christianity is that baptism makes you a member of his body, right? And it's we're stepping more into
we're gonna have to work through
a
lot of this in the coming episodes,
totally, to get us there.
But that's what you're getting at there is this beautiful. Again, it's like there's a beautiful irony in it, right? Where what Christianity ultimately amounts to is the deification of man, right? I mean, that we are elevated beyond ourselves into the life of God. And that is exactly that's exactly what the pagans are after. They want to be gods.
They want to be gods.
And not only do they want to be gods, but a god among them is necessary for their social order. Right? Like mm-hmm. a god among them, the god Socrates comes down, the philosopher appears to be a god, the Leviathan is the god among them is necessary. And because of the closed and finite nature of their problem, that god is one power of some sort, and then everyone else is a slave to it. But the deification of man through Christianity is that divinity courses down and through the whole. Like, in a sense, we're all gods, right? Like, I don't mean God in the sense of the Lord God. I mean, we're all gods in the sense of pagan gods. Like mm-hmm. what, you know what I mean? What they actually desired to be. Yeah, exactly. There, yeah. So, I think I'm excited to go through the treatise on law here. There's a lot. We're probably gonna have to do it fairly slowly, but let's start next time.
Definitely. And this was the real, what we were hoping for here is this transition, right? Yeah. That we've I think properly described the closed world. And what we see as being the political problems, and what we're going to do with the treatise on law is show how that movement upward in transcendence, both the Christ going down into law, into our fallen world, and then how we can start to how the church, how we can move towards salvation.
Well, and how this conception of politics comprehends all the problems we've talked about with paganism. So it doesn't ignore them, it comprehends them. Like it knows about human construction of law. It knows about the social reality, the corporate nature of justice. It knows about relative versus absolute truth. It's not denying that. It's not some sort of fideistic denial of all the problems that we've talked about. It is the comprehension of the problems and then the moving past them into the solution.
Yes.
Right. It's not a denial.
And just
of the problem.
kind of a last point. Like, this is also not like, oh, well, us Christians have the best thinkers, right? Like, we have the best philosophers.
That would just be another round.
That would just be another
thing.
Construction. What we're moving into theology, but properly because it's been revealed, right? Mm-hmm. Like, it's not because it's not because we have the best thinkers that can understand paganism. It's because God has revealed what it is, right? Like what St. Paul's saying in Romans, and Thomas is commenting on Romans a lot in the treatise.
Well, I think it basically is a sort of commentary on Romans.
Is what he's saying is that God has revealed to us the sin that we're living, and it has revealed to us, and now we can
breaks
start
the
to
mechanism.
understand.
I mean, that revelation breaks it, because part of the mechanism is its occultness. That it doesn't appear to be. So to be shown how it works, makes it no longer available to us.
Great. Well, I think it was good for a transition.
Great.
We'll move to the treatise on law next time.
Okay.
And thank you all for watching and listening, and we'll see you in the next one.